So again, I'm Jason Vinson. My company is Vinson Images. Who we are, so I'm a husband and wife team. This is my wife. This is our son, and then we also have a baby on the way. So we don't have a name yet, so it's Baby V. This is us, trying to be cool with a camera on a tripod. Talking about side hustles, that's kind of what Trevor already talked about. So I write articles for F-stoppers. I run the online community for SLR Lounge, and then I run the online community for Develop as well. And so it's just kind of, I love the photography community, so I just love to be kind of like involved and just be present and stuff like that, okay? So what we're talking about today is going to be shooting and editing for creative intent. So we are gonna be talking about a little bit how I use MagMod, but also natural light and how that gets incorporated into how I shoot and then also how I edit, okay? So shooting. I use a Sony A9, 35mm lens, 85mm lens, a Godox 8200, and then light and motion, like constant lights. Those are the only two lenses I've used for 4 years, but I just picked up a 24mm and I love it. Natural light, I use aperture priority with auto ISO and exposure compensation. Everyone can gasp, I know, it's blasphemy, but it really works very well for me, especially with the Sony because it has the EVF, so what you see is what you get whenever you're taking an image. So when a bride's coming down to see her dad for the first time and she's walking through a bright highlight, I can expose for this highlight, catch this image, and without having to make any sort of adjustments, just thumb on the exposure compensation dial to dial things up, dial things down. The instant she comes into the shade and hugs her dad, I don't know where the image is. It was there. Oh, what's that? Well, no, so there should be an image on this slide.
An image?
Yeah, it was there when we looked at, anyways, it's just a picture of her hugging her dad and her dad's like getting emotional and crying, but the instant they step into the shade, I don't have to make any sort of crazy adjustments to my ISO, shutter speed. The camera does 90% of the work and then I use exposure compensation to get me the rest of the way there, okay? When I'm shooting flash, at that point, I'm fully manual. When I have a flash, I'm setting up for a scene. The light is lighting a subject in a certain area. And so at that point, everything is dialed in. The flash is on manual. The camera's on manual, everything there, okay? So things like hair and makeup. This is one 8200 with a MagSphere and a MagGel. And this like blob of like out of focus is I'm just shooting through a shower door that's kind of foggy. And so that's how it kind of fades. And then I'm shooting at like f1.4, and so the shower door just kind of fades into this blob, but then she still remains sharp. And then I'm just waiting for the hairdresser to spray hairspray, okay? But things like portraits, it's set up, and so everything can be dialed in. In this situation, I have one 8200 with a grid on it and a sphere to light up this curtain. I'm using the sphere so that I can get this nice gradient from dark into these rich reds. And then behind them, I have another 8200 with a sphere, and I'm just blowing out the wall that's behind them and making that go all the way to white, okay? So talking about dynamic range, this is something that I take into account a lot when I shoot because it has a drastic way in how you can edit and how far you can push a file. So I stole this image off the internet. Basically, the human eye can see around 24 stops of dynamic range. And so if you look around the room, you can see things in the highlights and you can see things in the shadows, but your camera can only see a certain amount. This has 12 stops. Newer cameras are in the 14 to 15 range. And so you basically have to tell your camera what part of the dynamic range do you want to have. Anything that's on this side is gonna go straight to white. Anything on this side is gonna go straight to black, okay? So, yep. So why do we expose for the highlights? I like to think about taking an image. Each one of your pixels is like a bucket, and you want to fill that bucket up with as much water as possible without it overflowing, because the instant that bucket overflows, you're losing detail, okay? So here's an image. This is what the camera told me. Beautiful image in my backyard. The composition's great. The camera told me this is what the exposure should be. If you, in Lightroom, if you dial the exposure all the way back down, you can see how there's nothing here, like it's just straight white because there's no detail to be there. If I, in camera, underexpose to make sure that these highlights aren't blown, later on in post, when I drag it down, those blobs are gone because there's actually still detail there. So in post, I can bring up the shadows and make them look good. Here, the sun's super blown out. You don't have any detail in the clouds, but on the other image that I underexposed, the details there, they look pretty much the same because all of that detail is hidden in the shadow. So I just want to make sure that I don't clip my highlights, okay? One thing to consider, another image I stole off the internet, the higher up in ISO you go, the less dynamic range that you have. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're shooting. If you're shooting at ISO 100 or your base level ISOs, then you have more information to work with. And as you go up in ISOs, you want to get your exposures more locked down into what you want your image to look like, okay? So how can we draw attention to the subject? So whenever I'm taking an image, I'm trying to have a good eye on what is the brightest thing in the scene or an area with the most contrast. So in this situation, bright up against just a red wall, there's the sun shining on a tree, casting a shadow on this red wall. And so I just put her in a highlight and a somewhat clean spot and then have her do a little bit of motion. She's just standing in the sun here. But your eye instantly goes to her. She's a white dress, she's fully lit. And so your eye instantly goes to that situation. Same thing here, there's a lot of stuff going on here. There's canoers going through here. There's actually a bunch of otters that play up in all these like seaweed areas. But because they're sitting in these white chairs and in post, I've kind of made them a little bit brighter and made everything else just a little bit darker. It's not drastic, but your eye instantly goes to them, even though there's a lot of stuff going on in the scene. Silhouettes always work because it's contrast. So even though they're not the brightest in the scene, they're the subject of the most contrast in the scene, okay? And this is a funny pose that I learned from someone that I was like, oh, I'm gonna try that. They tell them to like kiss like a lizard and they make like super funny faces and laugh about it. And they just like totally went for it. And I was like, that's not what I was going for, but like, I love it anyways. Okay, so talking about a little bit about dynamic range. This is a scene, so the sun's coming in from about this direction, so just kind of raking across all this grass, hitting her, and then the tree's getting lit up, but the back is in shade, so it's all shade back there. This is another situation, so area of most contrast. This is a buddy of mine, Ray, he's throwing up the shoes, but he is a highlight against dark, and then the shoes are dark against a highlight, so areas of most contrast, okay? And then there's also color contrast. So on a color wheel, primary color, so red and green go well together, blue and orange go well together, yellow and magenta go well together, and so you can kind of play with these complementary colors to draw interest into your frame. So in a situation like this where the chapel is all orange, if I have a blue gel around them, it draws your eye into the frame. Okay, and so this situation, this is just, it's a AD200 with a blue gel, a grid, and a sphere pointed at a door behind them to light them up, making them an area of contrast. The flash freezes them, and I have my camera set to 1/4 of a second. During the exposure, I'm just going like this with my camera, and that's how you get this drag. So this is just a chapel that's lit up. But since it's using constant lights, as I do this, it streaks across the frame, okay? I'm probably from here to that white curtain.
Sorry, I meant them. How far away?
Oh, the flash is here. If this is the door, the flash is right here, like not quite touching the door. And the way I always set this up is that I have them put the flash in between their bodies. And so that way I know that the circle is always gonna be centered on them because the flash is in between them, okay? So again, color contrast. Everything is blue. This is a bride's dress that was just hanging in the window. She just had it hanging up there. So I put a flash behind the dress and I put a CTO gel on it to light up the dress with this little kiss of orange. And then this is just a car parked in their driveway that's black. And so it's reflecting the sky that's above them, okay? So exposing for the highlights. Making them go into shadow, and so they are something dark that's against a bright object and standing out. Okay, again, this is a similar situation to the tree shot. The sun is literally just coming down like this across them. And so I had them all turn into the sun. So they're all being lit. And then behind them is just a chapel wall that is all in shade. So exposing for the highlights, I expose for them. And then the chapel just goes to black, okay? Exposing for the highlights, put her against something dark, the groom in the foreground, and put him against something bright. Okay, so playing with that contrast. And then this is also complementary colors as well. The sky is blue, and then she's got this nice kiss of orange light on her, okay? Exposing for the midtones, this is a situation where you don't really need to maximize your dynamic range because there's not really crazy highlights and there's not crazy shadows. So in a situation here, not a ton of contrast, so I can just expose how I would normally would. I don't need to expose for the highlights in this situation, okay? And then exposing for the shadows, this is situations where I want the details in the shadows and I don't really care what the highlights do. They're just gonna go all to white and I don't really care what happens with those highlights. Okay, same situation, just let the background fall to white and let them be the star of the show. And this is another situation. So in this one, I'm exposing for, this is a bride. She's literally sitting in the same chair for both of these images. Nothing has changed. It's just how I do my exposure and then how I creatively edit it. So in this situation, I'm exposing for the highlights and I'm exposing for the shadows a little bit more. And so I can see all of her face and I don't really care what happens to the background here. Where in this situation, I'm exposing for this. You see how it's just a little bit hotter here? So I had her turn into that highlight and then I exposed for that highlight. And so this is a before and after. So expose for the highlight, let everything fall to black. This window is obviously, I just darkened that down to black in post, but I made sure that the majority of her highlight was framed within this dark point, because otherwise it'd be super hard to like paint in all of her hairs if it was against something that was white, because it's against something black. Whenever I edit it, this already went to black already. That makes sense? Yep. Okay. So that brings us into the editing portion of this. What I use Adobe Lightroom, Adobe Photoshop, and then develop presets. The reason why I use develop presets is they just have a style that I really love, and they have this thing called custom camera profiles. If you work with multiple camera brands, there's always this slight shift in the way cameras handle color science. And Develop has this way of bringing all cameras into the same color science, so you don't have to worry about matching colors from one camera to the other. It just kind of takes care of that for you. In the future, I'm just bringing this up in case later on you see me like post a video, but I'm getting ready to move Capture One. There's some amazing things that you can do with layers and colors and things like that. So I'm kind of in the process of playing around with that. I already touched on why Develop. Okay, so getting into some before and afters. This is the picture of the bridal party looking into the sun. So this is just straight out of camera. There, I'm actually underexposing the highlights here. So that helps the rest of the background go into black. And so that in post, whenever I go in, I can bump up my highlights and then drop my blacks and my shadows, and that helps boost them into the highlights, and then that helps this fall into black, okay? So here's after. Okay, very similar situation. There was this really cool white web that was against the back of a building. And so I underexposed the highlights. So in post, whenever I bump up my highlights, and then I have one flash behind them with a grid to light them and get them this little kiss of rim light, because I know I want all of these little spots to go to black. So in post, this is what you get, okay? Okay, so it's all, whenever I'm thinking about editing as well as shooting, how can we draw attention to where the viewer should be looking, okay? So in here, one of my favorite rules, it's not a hard rule, but if there's an emotional moment, I turn it to black and white. And it just draws you into the emotion instead of getting distracted by the color that's around there. In here, it's just kind of cleaning up what it is, making things that are, so like this wall is a little distracting, they're a little underexposed, so drawing attention to where you want the viewer to look. Darken down where you don't want them to look, brighten where you want them to look, okay? And then straighten up your edges, because I was literally like waiting for the groom to start walking down, and they're like peeking through this window that's up on a balcony, and I see them peeking, and so I have to like sprint down the aisle to like get this shot before they like hide back behind the window. Okay, so also white balance and color manipulation. This kind of goes into the style of shooting, or the complementary colors aspect of it. So here is an image that I thought I had this like great idea. I had one off-camera flash with a grid. It's pretty bright out, so I have it all the way up. And I had this idea I was gonna shoot the light through these dream catchers and cast that pattern of light onto the bride. And so you'd have all these like lines and stuff. And the very first time I did it, all it did was like this one line across her face. And I was like, oh, well, that's terrible, don't like it. So we moved on and we did something else. Well, later on in post, I was like, oh, well, this is kind of cool. And so going in, darkening down what's behind her, and then using a little bit of, basically I just drug a gradient down over these and then turned the white balance to blue. And so now we're playing with complementary colors, where if this was white, it would drastically draw your attention away from the scene, but making her skin tone's nice. She has a white dress, but it's not super bright. The brightest part is around her eyes because that's where I want you to look, and then everything else just kind of supports that. Okay? Very similar situation, so groom just looking in a mirror, and then making the wall just a little bit more blue and kind of draws your attention into the groom, into the mirror, okay? And behind him, it's already like a black wall, so that's super easy to make him pop out of the mirror. In this situation, I have one off-camera flash firing towards the bride, towards the back of her head. So it's basically just kind of rim lighting her face. And I'm shooting through a mirror. So this is a mirror. And have you ever seen like on mirrors where they have beveled edges? And so this is the beveled edge that comes through the corner. And so that's how you're getting these reflections. And so this is like the bevel of the mirror, and then this is her reflection. So I'm not actually taking a picture of her, I'm taking a picture of her through a mirror. And then in post, playing with the colors to draw attention into the subject. Okay, so pushing and pulling dynamic range. One of the cool things about dynamic range is that what you see is a very wide dynamic range. And so sometimes it's awesome to have an image that represents what you would normally see. And then sometimes it's awesome to drastically limit that dynamic range and show something that you don't normally see in an image. So limiting dynamic range would be something like this, where I'm exposing for the highlights and I want everything to fall to black. And so in post, I could get this. If I just brought up my shadows, this is all the detail that's within this file. And so my wife, I never actually did this edit, but for this presentation, I did this edit to show like how much detail's there. My wife's like, oh, I actually like that image better, but whatever. But this is the image I was actually going for, is let everything go to black. But the thing is like you can still kind of see these little trickles of light from the trees. Black and white helps a little bit, but you can still kind of see a little bit. So one of the things to keep in mind whenever you are pushing a file to let everything fall to black is that in Lightroom, there's a little button up here that you can push and it'll show you everything that is completely black. And so if I were to print this, all of these spots, even though maybe on the computer monitor it looks black to me, all this would print black, and then you would see all these weird splotches in the print because it's not all black, and so it's trying to print the different gradients, but it doesn't have the ability to print like that. And so in post, make sure that what you want to be black is all black. She's wearing a black shirt, but I still want detail on her shirt, so I used a brush to bring her shirt up. So in the previous image, it's all black, so I brought detail back to her shirt and then pushed everything back here to black. And that's how you get that. Okay. Here's another situation. So there's just a lamp on in the back of the room, just up against a corner. So I exposed for that highlight, framed her in that highlight, and then this wallpaper is really cool, so I just let that gradient of light go across that. But in this image, what I really liked is kind of this detail in her dress, and so I let that kind of be hidden in the shadows, but you can still see it. But for another edit, so pushing and pulling dynamic range. So what happens if we turn it black and white, and then we bring her dress out to white, and then we change the crop a little bit so it looks like a different image, okay? So here's another situation. This is a one off-camera flash with a sphere, a grid, and a gel. Just pointing at some rocks, and I'm across a river, and it's fall in Ithaca, New York. And so I had this idea of having all of the leaves intertwined in here and having them silhouetted against the rocks. So as I bring up my exposure and I push and pull my dynamic range, what I really wanted was all these yellow leaves everywhere all over the frame, and it just didn't work out how I had it envisioned in my head. And so in post, I can move those leaves around, I can fill in some of the blank spots. But again, everything in here is kind of all of the same tone. And so that's when I have the idea of how can I play with my colors to make them stand out more. And so in Lightroom, if I just turn them blue, now they instantly pop out. It's still the same image, but with those complementary colors that helps them stand out a little bit more, okay? And then likewise, I have another rule that if everything is the same tone, then it would look better as a black and white. And so playing with it being black and white. But once I do that, your eye wants to go to the brightest thing in the frame. And so they're bright, all these leaves are also bright. So in post, if I just drag the highlights down on the leaves and up the highlights on them, it's still the same image, but now your eye instantly goes to them instead of getting distracted by all the other hot spots that are in the area. And so now this is just visual interest, okay? So this is one off-camera flash with a grid, a sphere, and a gel. And I'm just lighting her from the side. And then in post, playing with those colors. Because I have a CTO gel on her, once I correct the white balance for her, the rest of this area kind of goes to this bluish tint. Okay, so that's how you do that. In this one, I have two off-camera flashes behind them. One has a blue gel, one has a red gel, and I'm just firing through some rain. And so that's how you get this gradient of color. And so then in post, and there's actually a white building in front of them. So what they're being lit by is a mixture of this orange light and blue light bouncing back onto them. And so in post, it's just a matter of cleaning up the white balance on them and then making sure that all these other colors are playing nice with each other. Okay. Okay, so just an overview of what we talked about, shooting for editing for creative intent. So what should the viewer be looking at? How do we need to capture the dynamic range? And then how can you accentuate your vision in post by pushing and pulling that dynamic range? Okay. Anybody have any questions?
Why are you so good?
I'm not. Practice. Thank you. All right, so if you want to keep up with me, this is my Instagram. It's VinsonImages_Jason on Instagram. If you look up our Vinson Images, you'll actually see Vinson Images and Vinson Images_Jason. The Vinson Images is my wife, so go ahead and follow both of them. And then I also have a Patreon account that I just launched, where I'm publishing some online content, some tutorials, things like that. So if you're interested in that, you can look it up on there. Awesome. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming.